scholar at our Weatherhead East Asian Institute. He also currently is teaching via Zoom as a visiting professor at Hong Kong University. And he teaches in the spring in India at Jindal Global University, which is just outside of New Delhi. Michael is one of the leading experts in the world on Hong Kong law, as well as Chinese law and comparative law. And he has recently published a book, which is distributed by Columbia University Press, called Making Hong Kong China. He's talking about how the Chinese legal system has gradually and then suddenly taken over in Hong Kong. There's a picture of the book, of the cover of the book. It's a short book intentionally. It's published in a series of short books on important topics. It's very, very well written, very clear. And with Hong Kong being such a hot topic now, I recommend this book to everybody. So today, Michael's going to give us his briefing on events in Hong Kong. He'll speak for about half an hour, and then we're going to have some dialogue and Q&A. Now, when you have questions that you want to ask him, please post them on the comment section of our YouTube page. And those questions will be sent over to me, and I'll convey them to Michael, maybe along with some questions of my own. So thank you for participating, and thank you, Michael, for joining us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, Andy, thank you so much. I appreciate this. I always appreciate opportunities to speak at Columbia University. As you know, I've done that many times. And in this case, I enjoy the opportunity to talk about the book. It's kind of a work of passion for me. I actually wrote it rather quickly as things started to unravel in Hong Kong. I had done a research trip last December to look at the protest movement and so on, and then this national security law came along, so I got involved. In the book, I try to show how the problems Hong Kong faces now and the kind of intrusion of China and the mainland system, the interferences that are so widely reported, are actually sort of embedded in the way that Hong Kong one country, two systems model was designed. It was designed, many people, I guess listening, most people will be familiar that it promised Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy, that the common law system would be maintained along with the rule of law, and that human rights and basic freedoms, in fact, according to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, would be maintained. The courts would be independent and final, and so on. And the ICCPR maintenance is quite interesting in Hong Kong because the Hong Kong Bill of Rights is one of the most unusual in the world, in that it's literally a photocopy of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So that all these tools were put in place. And I would say when that agreement was reached in 1984, China likes to present it, Chinese leaders present it as just Chinese policies, that it's their principles that they're applying. And they try often to ignore the fact that it was written into a treaty. And kind of dismissive of the treaty, even at one point saying the treaty was no longer valid, wasn't needed. After a lot of pushback on that, they conceded that the treaty still was in place. The treaty on its face says that the parties agree to carry out the principles of the treaty fully throughout the time that it applies, which was 50 years after the handover. I would add something else, and I add this in the book, that there was at the end of World War II, with the creation of the UN, principles in the UN Charter on self-determination and decolonization. And in Hong Kong, they were not applied, that China objected to Hong Kong being on a list of colonies, and the British removed it. And I would add, so maybe giving the treaty even more importance, is that it in effect became, the Sino-British Joint Declaration became a substitute for this right that otherwise would accrue to Hong Kong. And I think that's why some Hong Kongers have raised this idea of self-determination as important rhetoric in dealing with this. however one views that treaty and its obligations, the treaty itself stipulated that its content would be included in a basic law for Hong Kong, and that basic law was enacted in early 1990. And this is kind of where the book focuses most of its attention. There's a little background in it, but mostly from the handover forward. And I argue in the book that there were actually two flaws in the basic law that have haunted Hong Kong ever since. And one of these is in Article 158 of the Basic Law, which gave in effect the final power of interpretation of the Basic Law to the NPC Standing Committee in Beijing, a political body. And so that meant that when Beijing had some strong interest in what was happening on Hong Kong, and often this might be very much contestable and perhaps even contested in the Hong Kong courts. And when the first occasion when the Beijing Standing Committee interpreted basic law, they effectively overruled a decision of the Court of Final Appeal in Hong Kong. The Basic Law, Article 158, gave that court the obligation in cases of local central relations or central authority to refer the matter to the NPC. And the court had held in that case that it didn't have to refer it because this was a matter within Hong Kong's autonomy. So at that point, the government of Hong Kong overruled the court by sending it to Beijing itself, even though there's no provision for that. And I say so that's one of the flaws. In effect, hanging over the Hong Kong rule of law from that day forward has been this idea in sensitive cases that Beijing will overrule the Hong Kong courts applying the law, the common law tradition, and applying the basic law under the common law tradition. The other flaw was the guarantees about Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong, which was included in the joint declaration. But in the basic law, it took the form of China promising that the ultimate aim was universal suffrage in Hong Kong, and that this was to be achieved by gradual and orderly progress. Well, China, but armed with the power of interpreting the basic law, and with this article in hand, has basically drug its heels on that reform. And so Hong Kong's chief executive to this day is not directly elected by the people and tends to be answerable to Beijing. And so when you see people protesting in Hong Kong over almost any issue during these intervening years, up till more heightened conflict in 2019 and 2020, it's pretty much a kind of public recognition that the Hong Kong government doesn't well represent the Hong Kong people, that rather it tends to represent Beijing and Hong Kong. And that this means that the autonomy of Hong Kong, that this government is generally viewed as unable to defend that autonomy. And that being the case, the protesters are worried that Hong Kong's rule of law will be under threat. So even when protesters in various years are protesting over other seeming issues, I was even involved myself in the Article 23 debate, where the first time there was an attempt to impose national security laws in Hong Kong. And the protest over that was that it gave too much sort of authority to over national security in Hong Kong to Beijing, and protest ensued. We wrote a bunch of pamphlets and so on and distributed them, and 500,000 people took to the streets. So Hong Kong people from that day forward kind of realized that that law was then, a proposal was withdrawn. So there was a kind of recognition that the only way to control this boundary between mainland and Hong Kong was to take to the street. So in a sense, the kind of protest that Beijing is so incensed by, and the public order issues associated with that, are in some ways caused by these very flaws in the way Beijing has interfered with the assistance of the Hong Kong government. And that was in 2003. In 2004, there was a massive protest over democracy. And the result was that the Beijing National People's Congress Standing Committee said that it had the ultimate power to decide, even when it came to the Legislative Council, whether more democratic reform would be allowed, even though the basic law on its face said that the local government could do that on its own and report it to Beijing for the record. So there it is again, the people are protesting over democracy. A few protests ensued after that in the intervening years, one over patriotic education, feeling that all these protests on the street means the young people aren't being trained adequately to honor China's traditions and history and so on. They're not patriotic enough. So there was an attempt to impose that, and protest ensued, and that attempt was withdrawn. So sometimes the protesters have won, and they kind of learned in Hong Kong that if you stand your ground firmly enough, you might win. But they've never been able to win over democracy. So we know in 2014 and 15, there was an umbrella movement, and that movement produced no results when it came to actually achieving democratic reform. It became a great public relations exercise to draw the world's attention to the problem in Hong Kong, but the Beijing was no back down on that. And so the Hong Kong government was in lockstep with Beijing in denying that. And then we know in 2019, and the book talks about this, there were these massive protests. And then there was a kind of feeling, well, it was initiated because the Hong Kong government was going to get an extradition bill through that would see Hong Kongers actually could be extradited to the mainland rather easily under a number, virtually any time the mainland law, there was a claim of mainland law violation. There was some exception set up because businessmen worried that they would be sent up there maybe when they breached contract with somebody in a local area, and that would be turned into a criminal charge and that they could be extradited. So some of that was revised, but the government essentially initially refused to back down. There was also some provisions to protect rights, but no tools in the courts to achieve that. In effect, relying on the chief executive, which everyone knows in Hong Kong answers to Beijing, to decide if there was a concern about that. So all of these things are going on in 2019. And then the young protesters who had been really activated by the attempt to impose patriotic education on them in 2012, they were sort of had taken over the umbrella movement in 2015. So Beijing found a whole new generation of Hong Kong activists facing them on the street. And these young activists, looking at the results of past protests, even in 2019 itself, in June, 2 protests, 1 million people marching and 2 million people marching, produced no result. There came this idea that was posted in the Legislative Council wall at one point when the protesters occupied the Legislative Council, that you taught us that nonviolent protest doesn't work. So there was this kind of idea in Hong Kong that people had to really get nasty about protesting. And then at the same time, Beijing seemed to, in some ways, have a lot of sway over police tactics. And the police tactics were also very aggressive and violent. And so the protesters, even when they got the bill withdrawn, the extradition bill, they had 5 demands in total. One of them was the extradition bill, but others were that these charges that, eventually some 9,000 to 10,000 people would be arrested in these protests, and that these charges be dropped, that the characterization of the protesters' riots be withdrawn, and then most importantly, that the police behavior be independently investigated, and then finally that there be revisiting of the democratic reform that was abandoned in 2014 and 15 at the end of the umbrella movement. So all of these demands, they say 5 demands, nothing less in their protest. And all of this is going on. And there's a sense, and I was there and able to interview people, and this is in the book in one of the chapters, I think 5, chapter 5, the kinds of thinking that people were having in December when these protests were still going on. And there was a kind of optimism that Beijing wouldn't come in and trash Hong Kong. Much of the world worried that Hong Kong would have tanks like Tiananmen Square, but Hong Kong activists kind of thought, no, they're not going to do that. The price of doing that would be too great. And they don't need to do it. Many scholars that looked at this concluded they really didn't need to send in the army because they had very strong control over the local police. And the local police seemed to be, the local government and the local police all were in Beijing's corner on this, and using very aggressive tactics that maybe the mainland system would have. And so there was also, I think, among academics, the sense that there's no need to send in, that if Beijing wants to carry out its agenda in Hong Kong, it probably won't resort to the People's Liberation Army or anything of that nature. So that's where we were at the beginning of 2020, and that brought us to the national security law. Now, the book talks about all these things in some length and talks about the 2019 protest in particular, because I did a visit and interviews with people on both sides of the protest during the late stage of the 2019 protest. So then along comes Beijing's solution, announced in early summer of 2020 and promulgated on June 30th of 2020 is the new national security law. And this is something that really is a grave move in Hong Kong. We can say in some ways 2019 police tactics already showed a kind of crackdown on the opposition camp in Hong Kong, the arrest of opposition leaders, and some leaders who were not even much party to these 2019 protests. Some of the traditional leaders who were somewhat on the sidelines during the 2019 protest, even advocating that the youngsters not use violence, that they stick with nonviolence and so on. And these leaders were in early 2020 being targeted, and late 2019 being targeted for arrest. So one gets the sense that Beijing isn't just encouraging that those active on the street be arrested, and they were, several of them were, even some of them were still being tried from their actions in 2015, but also that there was a kind of list of people they wanted to get, and that those people are being targeted now in 2020 for arrest and going on trial and so on. And some of them are being targeted under the national security law, but a lot of them under the public order laws of various stripes that already were on the books. So all of this is going on, and there's a sense in Hong Kong of deep concern that basically Hong Kong as they know it is disappearing. Now, some people would argue, oh, it's because of the the Gini coefficient, the economic disparities in Hong Kong. And that's a part of the story, but it's kind of communist China's answer to everything, that if people have problems, they're economic. And they say this about Tibet, they say this about the Uyghurs, they say this pretty much everywhere. And in Hong Kong, that exists, but the protesters are insisting this is about the political system, because in their view, the economic status of Hong Kong and its continuing role as both a cultural and financial center depends on upholding the one country, two systems framework and the basic law commitments. So there's a kind of rejection of just making it about the economy stupid argument, but something more than that is insisted upon. So it's a kind of identity politics going on. So along comes the national security law. And this, in a way, in my view, I argue in the book, in effect becomes a constitutional amendment. That the basic law, the Constitution of Hong Kong, is probably inferior to the national security law. They are both national laws under Chinese system. So the basic law was enacted by the NPC, and so was the national security law. But under China's legislative law, if you just looked at that, then you would conclude that if the basic law is in conflict with the national security law in any area, that the national security law will prevail. Because under China's legislation law, I think it's Articles 83 and 85, it says that the latest national law enacted, which is a common principle in legal systems around the world, which allows legislatures to amend previous laws. They enact the latest law, and the more specific law governs over an earlier law that's more general. So there's a good argument that that is the case, that in effect, the national security law has now become part of the Constitution of Hong Kong. I even was in a panel of lawyers in Hong Kong, again via Zoom, where Maria Tam and other pro-Beijing officials were arguing effectively that it constituted an amendment. And as such, it puts in really under threat all of these human rights guarantees and so on that I mentioned in the beginning, and the rule of law. And it does it in a very systematic way. It starts out by doing it because the national security law was rammed through without consulting the public at all. Even the chief executive of Hong Kong said she first saw it on the day it was enacted. And so there was no consultation, even under the Mainland legislative law I just mentioned. People who have an interest in laws that are being proposed are to be consulted. There was no consultation. It was just pushed through. So that was a kind of a rule of law problem already. And as I mentioned, it says on its face that it's superior to all local laws. And as I said, it's probably also superior even to the basic law. My colleague in Hong Kong, Fu Hualing, has argued that basic laws are a little different breed than ordinary national laws, and that perhaps the basic law could be argued to have survived as the superior document. But I think there's a problem with that, and I have great respect for Fu Hualing's analysis. But I think the problem is that I don't see how the courts could actually declare part of the national security law invalid as violating the basic law, or whatever's being done under the national security law as invalid in violation of the basic law. I would think because the mainland officials constantly attack Hong Kong courts when they exercise constitutional judicial review power. I would think if they had the audacity to declare parts of the national security law invalid, that Beijing would step up immediately. And under the national security law, it has the power to interpret the national security law that the NPC Standing Committee does, as it does also the basic law. So it would overrule a court. So while in theory, you could say a basic law perhaps is a special breed of law that survives, and those commitments to Hong Kong survive, I don't think anyone really has confidence in that at all because of the NPC's power. And then on top of all of this, one of the key planks, the key functions that we can see emerging with this national security law is an intention to tame the courts. We've seen that mainland officials frequently criticize local judges when they get in the way of law enforcement in various contexts against protesters and so on, where they dismiss cases as having inadequate evidence and so on, or the police mishandling it, whatever. These are attacked all the time. And there's a whole army of pro-Beijing local people also who come out and attack the courts. So right now the courts are under attack all the time. And they are attacked in these mainland newspapers and stuff like the Da Gong Bao or the One Way Bao. And so it's not a small matter. But in the case of the national security law, the law itself provides that the chief executive shall designate a list of judges who can hear these cases. So if that's not a signal that we don't trust the average judge in Hong Kong to get it right on national security, then what is? And in fact, it goes on to say in another article that if judges make statements or in any way violate national security, that they will be dismissed from the list. They will be taken off the list. And of course, you think, well, how's a common law judge who has all these ethical limitations about involvement in politics going to make statements that violate the national security of China? Obviously, it's going to occur in their judgments and their decisions in cases. It's going to be what they say in court. And in fact, we know that some of the attacks on judges are specifically over what they said in court. So this is, I think, pretty much says the writing on the wall. Now, the national security law gets worse because autonomy would mean that mainland officials under the basic law are told in Article 22 and 18 and others, one, we're told that national laws do not apply in Hong Kong unless they're listed in Annex 3 of the basic law, which now the national security law is. And further, that mainland officials under the central government are not to interfere in Hong Kong, okay? But now, instead, we have, overwhelming mainland interference because under the national security law, a committee is set up. And the committee is headed by the chief executive. But that committee on safeguarding national security is to do all its work in secret and decide where national security threats exist. And it itself is not subject to judicial review expressly in the national security law. So it's kind of a lawless body. And on top of everything else, it's under the supervision of the Central People's Government. And then an advisor to the committee is to be appointed, and one has been appointed. He's the head of the local liaison office. So this and so we can all sit back and pretty much surmise that this advisor is not so much an advisor as a supervisor of this committee on safeguarding national security, because he's representing the Central People's Government under which the committee is to operate. So autonomy is obviously threatened there, but it gets worse. They also set up under the national security law an office for safeguarding national security. And this is to be staffed entirely by mainland officials from mainland public security bureaus and state security apparatuses. And these people are to operate in secret and are to be beyond the jurisdiction of Hong Kong. Okay. And so there again, the local police and the local Department of Justice is to have a special branches who handle national security. And those people, no one else is allowed to be involved with national security cases except those people. And under the Committee on Safeguarding National Security, they even issued regulations on what the police can do, the special branch of police on national security. And among other things, they can do warrantless searches and surveillance and all kinds of things. They're in normal times are supposed to go to a magistrate, one of these listed magistrates, but other times, if they deem it necessary, they can go ahead without the court's assistance. So all of this is going on. And then this mainland office, it has the power to send people arrested across the border for trial on the mainland. So both the rule of law and autonomy are severely tested there. They're supposed to have the chief executive's approval, but of course the chief executive is working for mainland officials in a way, as already pointed out. So the national security law has a real tangle of ways that put Hong Kong's autonomy at risk. Now, human rights, of course, are at risk under it. Everyone kind of got that immediately when it was passed, because it has these crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism activities, and collusion. And then it has all these provisions about abetting these things or inciting these things, but these things are not defined at all. And collusion is clearly concerned, and it talks about foreign interference. It's concerned with Hong Kongers trying to appeal to foreign governments. And so that's the kind of collusion. In fact, charges were immediately laid against a number of people. We understand, because it's secret, we don't quite know fully what they're being charged with, but it's from the interrogations they experienced, apparently for putting up ads and stuff for support of what's called Stand With Hong Kong abroad in newspapers and so on. So Jimmy Lai was arrested. He's a prominent publisher. Agnes Chow, a prominent activist. These people were arrested. Jimmy Lai's sons were arrested. His office managers were arrested. And then about 200 police were sent to his newspaper to rummage through both the reporting offices and the management offices. And then later, apparently this was a fishing expedition, because later then they wanted to go search Jimmy Lai's house as well. So it would be nice if the national security law had all this stuff and that nobody was going to use it. But the risk is not, it's not that. I mean, they've had things like the emergency regulations ordinance on the books for years, was never used until 2019. It was used then and again in 2020, it was used under these face mask laws and stuff. They've had sedition laws on the book. So one argument would be, oh, well, these are laws, but they're really going to use it. And officials even said that, only to get a few bad apples, except the bad apples that are affected by this are half the population of Hong Kong, because there was a primary election and they were accusing the organizer of that primary election of violating the national security law. Presumably the 610,000 people who voted in that would be violating it. There are provisions in the national security law to oversee education and make sure education and the media are not violating national security, and that students are properly educated on China's history and traditions and so on. So all the student population of Hong Kong is affected by the national security law. So I could go on and on talking about how it's not just a piece of paper, but it's actually being used, and it's not all being used in the criminal channel. Some of it's being used in other ways like education and oversight. They're even supposed to oversee the behavior of international press. And even the New York Times moved part of its offices out of Hong Kong out of concern for this. And then finally, everyone abroad knows, because it's been widely reported, that the law applies globally. So we could be violating the national security law in this this session we're having right now. I'm sorry, Andy, but there's some risk of that, because one of the things you do to subvert is you bring contempt or hatred on public officials or the government. And so even though I'm not trying to bring contempt or hatred, I'm trying to persuade and convince maybe this wasn't a good idea. It's maybe something that could be done better. I suppose the other side would think that my criticism might bring contempt or hatred. So this, I think, is the nub of the problem. And I noticed that I've gone on for 33 minutes. Sorry for exceeding it by 3, but I think there's a lot of room for discussion now.
That's perfect. That's great. I want to remind the folks who are listening that you can put your questions into the comment section on the YouTube page, and they'll be sent over to me, and then I can ask Michael. But I certainly have some questions of my own. So Michael, you've given a wonderful description of this national security law, which is sort of like layer upon layer upon layer. So the bottom layer is that the Hong Kong chief executive runs a committee which operates in secret and has the power to direct a special unit of the police and has the power to, as you said, control the courts by channeling cases to certain judges who cooperate and getting rid of judges that don't cooperate. So that's the bottom level. And then the next level up is that the mainland sends an advisor to sit with this committee and, as you said, to really supervise rather than advise. And then there's a level on top of that, which is this National Security Office. And then there's the ability of the mainland authorities to take people out of Hong Kong to try them. And then there's the power of the National People's Congress Standing Committee to interpret the law. So it's like many, many levels. And that leads me to two, and beyond that, there's the unspoken levels, as they're not in the law, like the role of the Chinese Communist Party in the National People's Congress Standing Committee. So I have two questions about that. One is that what is the function of this National Security Office? So the head of that National Security Office is the guy that sits with the chief executive's secret committee. Do we have any other idea of what else that office does? Is it carrying out investigations of its own outside the alongside the Hong Kong police? And then that's my specific question. And my sort of big question is, why do you think it's an extraordinary legal structure? I'm not a comparative law specialist, but I never heard of anything like it that has so many fail-safes in it, so many, backstops. I mean, why was it written that way? What are they afraid of? Or even the laws in China are not written like this.
Oh, yeah. In fact, it's interesting. Jerry Cohen likes to point out that national security type laws, over making trouble and all sorts of other things in China, subversion, typically, even though they apply globally, they do not apply to actions taken abroad that are in conformity with the local law abroad. Where this one applies even if you're following. I mean, we know that I didn't mention, but 6 warrants have been issued for people that are overseas under this law. And one of them is an American citizen, Samuel Chu. And so his crime is lobbying his own Congress over legislation. So it's so comprehensive. In my view, I think I should note a correction. The advisor is the head of the liaison office, is the advisor to the committee, not the head of the office of the central government. I would say in the central government office, we have no clue what they're doing. Presumably, now that it's legal, I'm sure there were operatives of the mainland public security and others in Hong Kong, state security in Hong Kong, probably before all of this, probably quietly going around and looking in. We know that booksellers were snatched off the streets and things. So there've been people physically present in Hong Kong from the mainland's security apparatus. But on this law, the office that we're talking about is not subject to local jurisdiction, and is supposed to operate in secret. So in effect, it's a secret police. They've taken over a hotel to turn it into an office. And I assume they have hundreds of operatives, a couple hundred at least is the figure you frequently hear on the street, that are there, and that some activists have noted that cars parked outside of their houses and stuff. So that there is a kind of secret police, and even the Hong Kong police that are in the special unit can operate in secret ways as well. And as I pointed out, under the first regulation issued by the committee regarding, I think it's Article 43 on what the police, how they conduct their business, again, provides for them in some cases to exercise surveillance even without a warrant. And there's even some provisions there in that special regulation, not the national security law itself, that suggest even the lawyers of defendants might find their office, surveilled and stuff, that legal defense provisions are there. So this very comprehensive, as you say. And if I had to guess, and we're all guessing what is on the mind of Beijing officials, I know, Andy, you've spent a lot of your life doing that. And so we can try to guess what it is, but I think it's that story I told, that going all the way back. I didn't go back before the handover, but they were already choosing people, advisors, and all kinds of things long before in the 1990s and the late 1980s. Even they're sort of pro-Beijing camp, the anointed people that work with Beijing, and they get rewarded for that. They get appointed to things that, if they're doing business in China, that might be to their advantage, and so on. Dealing with mainland companies. I mean, there's a footnote here as well. I mean, all of this guanxi, these connections and support for Beijing and Beijing's way of interfering in Hong Kong means that even the business field is kind of not level, that people who take care of China may find they have advantages over people who don't. And so companies are under pressure to express their support, and expressly were asked to support the national security law. So all of this is going on. Beijing's been there a long time. And I think what they find over time in an open society, that merely, cultivating a network of supporters doesn't get them all the way where they want it to be, that they can control things and silence opposition and so on. So they keep, over these years, as I pointed out in the book, from the handover forward, trying to build these ways, the flaws I mentioned, using those, incorporating them in the basic law so that they can control things. And I think that what's happened is, as they keep controlling, I call it Newton's law, the more you repress, the more resistance you get. So they keep getting more and more resistance. So they've actually built up the protest movement in Hong Kong by, and Hong Kong people aren't naturally a bunch of protesters. I remember when I first taught my class in Hong Kong, and I asked them, and I think I even mentioned this in the book, I don't recall. I asked the students, I said, well, what would you do? This was 1985. What would you do? Is the Sino-British Treaty okay? Or what would you do for Hong Kong's future? First, they rejected my question because they said, we've never been asked that. And then their second response was that they would have Hong Kong return to China and then hire the British to run it. So in effect, their choice wasn't that we would run it. I was saying, you're talking about a society at the start of this process that was not that political, in the 80s when these agreements were signed, that it was a colony, and there had been no rich tradition of political participation and so on. Very much the business of Hong Kong was business. So I think that kind of starting point was changed by all of this process of interference and the perception that there's a threat to the Hong Kong that all the people relied upon. And so when we get to this stage, they've been years of protest, and Beijing's incensed by this and decides to write up something that this time it's going to take charge of it all. And it gets the Hong Kong government on board. There's a discipline going on there. And to my surprise, I had expected at some point in all of this, there'd be some officials who would resign and say, no, I'm not going to be a part of this, but I haven't seen them. So the Beijing's capacity to engender discipline within the Hong Kong political elites that it's cultivated is apparently very good. And at the same time, now taking this hard line, it's able to get support for this national security law. I would have hoped it would have been otherwise. I've argued in many op-eds that if Beijing's pro-Beijing supporters were able to convey to Beijing what Hong Kong people were concerned about, we could have avoided a lot of these problems. But these people are so well rewarded for just spouting the party line that they've never stood up. And so perhaps it should be no surprise that none of them stood up and said no to the national security law. So this, I think, is what's going on. And this law is just well crafted because there's a distrust, I think, of the Hong Kong government's capacity to keep the lid on all these opposition in Hong Kong. So if we can't trust you to do it, we're going to make sure we got all the tools in our hands, and they do it. And there's no resistance from these officials that they've designated.
Thank you. We have some good questions from people listening, but I wonder if, let me just ask one more, summarize sort of what I hear you saying here. Is there three actors? There's the pro-Beijing elite in Hong Kong, and then there's the mass public, and then there's decision makers in China. And the decision makers in China have great faith in the loyalty of the Hong Kong elite.
Yeah.
And that's been correct. The Hong Kong elite has proven to be loyal. It'd be interesting to ask why, whether it's just economic or whether they feel that Hong Kong has really no other option. So that's one relationship in the triangle. The other relationships in the triangle are a little puzzling to me. When did the Hong Kong public, or a big part of the Hong Kong public, really change their mind? Because as you said, in 1985, they were not averse to, as I understand it, to sort of returning to Chinese sovereignty. And I think I remember that in the late 90s, after retrocession, they were pretty open to taking on the identity of Chinese PRC citizens. And at some point, a lot of the public in Hong Kong changed their identity from PRC citizens to Hong Kong people. When did that happen and why? And then again, in this historical framework, it seems like, I remember when in 97, when Hong Kong went back to Chinese sovereignty, Martin Lee, who's a great friend of yours, was telling us that he was getting ready to go to jail. He expected to go to jail right after 97. He said that he was engaged in some physical self-discipline not, I think he said he was drinking only water and not tea because they wouldn't give him tea in jail, something like that. He was ready to go to jail, but he's never gone to jail. So it seems like the Beijing authorities were pretty light, like Robert Kwok bought the South China Morning Post, and then what's his name, Ma bought the South China Morning Post, but the South China Morning Post still publishes a lot of good journalism on China. In other words, the crackdown was expected in 97, and it didn't happen and didn't happen and didn't happen and didn't happen. And then it was a huge crackdown all of a sudden, is the impression I'm getting. So I wonder if what you think about that interpretation of the historical trend, Hong Kong identity building up gradually and Beijing being very, very patient up to a certain point and then somehow deciding to come down like a hammer.
Yeah, I think I would make a couple amendments. One is there was a lot of resistance to the handover before the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed in the early 80s. There was a flight from Hong Kong, and then the Sino-British Treaty came along with all these promises, and it sounded like a reliable model. And then I think you're right. At that point, there's more confidence in it. A few immigrants went off to Canada and such, but more or less their confidence grew in the city. And when the resistance after the handovers first took real shape, I think, was that those protests over Article 23 legislation, the national security protest in 2003. And I think it's at that point that Beijing realized that it, was riding a bit of a wild horse there, that things could get, that the Hong Kong people were not going to quietly, passively go along with everything that Beijing wanted. And so there starts to be this, that's when, they start a few years later proposing patriotic education and all this. There's a sense that things are this way. And while this is all going on, I think this is where I felt that the pro-Beijing establishment, the elites who were doing Beijing's bidding in Hong Kong, in my view, are the one group that has most let Hong Kong down. Because I think if they had China, you're right, there was some sense that China really didn't want to rule Hong Kong in a detailed sort of way, that it would be happy to let Hong Kong people rule Hong Kong as long as its needs were taken care of. But I think these elites, as China starts trying to ratchet up its control of things, in the face of these protests that start taking place, these elites never found their voice. I don't think anyone expected them to fight Beijing, but they expected them to have a voice, to be able to explain, to be a sort of intermediary kind of force to explain what Hong Kong people were concerned about, because most of the time they were just concerned about preserving the rule of law. They saw democracy as instrumental to that, because the government itself, that was not democratically elected, was not doing a good job of defending Hong Kong's autonomy. It was too compliant and complicit with Beijing. So I think this just slowly builds up over time as the protests ensue and Beijing keeps tightening the screws. Even, before that, I mean, this Article 23 legislation, the patriotic education, building bridges to Zhuhai and all these places to try to put Hong Kong integrated into the Bay region in the south of China. So all of these things, that Beijing's expectation is these people will become more and more like the rest of China, and the people themselves didn't want to be like the rest of China. So they're resisting it because they wanted these promises to be carried out. And then, of course, when we get to the the umbrella movement, then it's the cast is the die is cast. And Benny Tai and others are promoting civil disobedience and nonviolence. So the quiet marches in the street are no longer sufficient in the view of the street. And so that then I think the tension between Beijing and the street in Hong Kong gets past the point of no return in a way. It starts getting bad. And I mean, Hong Kong, these leaders in Hong Kong could still have done better to try to calm things down and get Beijing to understand what people were asking for. I mean, even in 2019, these 5 demands, when you really deconstruct them, they really come down to not prosecuting all these people because they had some legitimate concerns about, this extradition law and so on, withdrawing the bill, and maybe taking another swipe at democratic reform. And I think that would have been a much better result than we see now. I don't see there's kind of a hopelessness now in Hong Kong. And so I think that's kind of where we're at. So I think it builds up over time. But like anything, when you put pressure on people, their sense of identity grows, their sense of solidarity and identity. It's a kind of natural outcome of that. And I don't think that was thought out that well, that in effect, Beijing is its own worst enemy when it comes to this. causing this kind of thing.
Thank you. I'm going to give you, Michael, if you open your chat window, you can also see the questions, but I'll start with the first one on top. I don't know who it came from, but the question says, has China used, quote, enemy of the state or, quote, traitor terminology for Western-supported activists and demonstrators? Would it be justified to use these terms? Should we term Western powers, mainly USA and UK, attempts to influence the Hong Kong situation as neo-colonialism? So let me sort of elaborate that question. I think the question relates to the Chinese view that the demonstrations were somehow backed up by Western powers. I know that Beijing accused the National Endowment for Democracy of having a lot to do with it. So I think this question is partly, what do you think about the amount of Western influence, whether it's the NED or some other form of Western influence, as something that's important in promoting these demonstrations, and would Beijing be justified in regarding the demonstrators as traitors or enemies of the state? And would it be correct to say that the Western powers' attitude is neo-colonialist, even if either by putting their hands into the situation or even by just condemning it, verbally calling it out? So, sort of, what is the Western role in all of this?
Well, there's no question that China believes America and other countries are stirring this up. My impression from just knowing the people, and actually I was a fellow at the NED, I did this there's a 5-month fellowship there I did right after, in 2016, after I left Hong Kong. I think they're overestimating these Western organizations' capacity to mobilize people on the streets in Hong Kong. They're not doing that. I mean, when you talk to the activists, I remember when Benny Tai was just thinking about these umbrella movement, which in those days it was Occupy Central campaign, in Love and Peace, as they called it. They were reading the literature on nonviolent protest, and we're using the tactics, of nonviolence that are widely scattered around the world. We know the monks in Myanmar used it. We know in Tahrir Square they were using the same literature, and so on. So what I think, instead of a kind of interference in real physical involvement on the ground, what really happens are the ideas that come out of things like the National Endowment for Democracy or other pro-democracy, open society organizations. And that is a competition of ideas that Beijing tends to lose in places like Hong Kong, that the street, if we can call it that, the civil society is more attracted to these other ideas. But I think in the case of Hong Kong, it's even less of a cause for them to be labeled enemies of the people, because these ideas that we're talking about are written into the basic law. These are the guarantees. So in effect, the agreement is that Hong Kong will enjoy these kinds of freedoms and so on, that Beijing's side may view as Western ideas and stuff that are in the heads of Hong Kong's young activists. I think, so that's one side of it, that these young people, and I taught them for 30 years in universities, trust me, they know how to come up with these ideas. They study comparative politics and comparative law and human rights and all these things. These ideas are accessible globally in an open society, and they use them. Now, what about the Western governments stepping in and speaking up? Even there, the basic law itself and the Sino-British Treaty invites that. They asked the foreign governments, the US, that Beijing officials back in the day traveled to Washington after they signed the Sino-British Treaty to try to get the United States to agree to these ideas. They did the same thing in regard to the Basic Law. They sent people there to talk about it and to persuade foreign governments to treat Hong Kong differently than it treated China when it came to a number of things, but especially trade and exchange, cultural exchanges, and different kinds of things. That Hong Kong was to be an open society, and that these foreign governments, in dealing with Hong Kong, could rely on that, the rule of law and the promises in the Basic Law. So in a way, these governments have every reason to complain if these things are rolled back, as I argue in the book. And there's a chapter in the book, it's chapter 7, I believe it is, that talks about this international aspect of it. And in a lot of the international activities, that statements, the laws like the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act are actually being promoted by exile Hong Kongers or Americans of Hong Kong ancestry or origin, because they're concerned about their homeland, as it were. And so they work to try to promote some kind of oversight to see that the commitments in the Sino-British Treaty and the Basic Law are adhered to. So I think while Beijing officials are fond of taking the view of foreign interference, they do that almost every time there's opposition in China. I remember I was in China when the Uyghur protest in 2009 occurred. And I watched the evening news, and the entire evening news was an accusation, not that an examination, not of extended evening news, by the way, not of how the conditions were for life in Xinjiang, but rather about accusations of foreign interference. So this is a kind of default position when China confronts opposition. And some Hong Kong pro-Beijing elites are fond of this position as well, because they hold their status based on this kind of argument, this distrust of foreign interference. So I think it's the foreign interference that I've seen seems to be somewhat invited by the very condition of one country, two systems.
So speaking of invited foreign interference, Hong Kong is a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and it reports as a separate unit to the treaty bodies that supervise these two covenants. And the national security law itself has an article, I forget which number, that says that the government will respect the human rights of people in Hong Kong. So there would seem to be an opening to pursue Western complaints about the national security law in Geneva, in the Human Rights Council and the treaty bodies and so on. That's a legal channel that exists, but do you think it's any use?
Probably not. We know the Human Rights Council, the United States current administration has pulled out of the council, pulled out when it was in, and has not been active in the council. My former students and associates that I know that work there say that Beijing has huge influence in the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and will be very outspoken when they try to do anything that Beijing perceives as a threat. So I think the chances of getting any activity out of these organizations is probably limited. There's been some of these special rapporteurs who have sort of signed letters speaking up on this. So some of that international activist community that's in government or in these bodies has tried to speak out on these issues, but not very much, not very successfully, and their act statements are dismissed by Beijing. So it is the never-ending question is when China has problems with human rights, whether it's in Xinjiang or Tibet or Hong Kong, how effective is international criticism through these various human rights bodies? And so far the answer seems not too effective. And then, well, should we be doing that, or are we wasting our time? And the answer to that tends to be no, we're obliged to do that, that this is something that the commitment to human rights requires us to speak up. And maybe we just have to be hopeful that there's a point where, sometimes what's done overseas takes on meaning locally in a country like China. And so there may be a point where some voices are, even if the government rejects what you're saying, that some local voices gain strength and credibility from outside monitoring that occurs. So that, I think, is how people in the human rights movement tend to deal with this question that we're struggling with here.
So let's look at the questions from Christopher Grandage. And
Yeah.
there's 3 of them, I think, but they're all kind of linked, so we can look at them together. So one is, you spoke of a new generation of young activists that has emerged since 2012. Do you think the thoughts and feelings of these protesters are representative of the wider Hong Kong community? And then he says, with its wide-reaching new limitations on freedoms in Hong Kong, does the national security law spell the end of mass public protest in Hong Kong? And is protest becoming a way of life in Hong Kong, a part of Hong Kong's social fabric as such? So these 3 questions really kind of all relate to a sense of the public mood in Hong Kong, how many people, we know that the demonstrations were very large, but we also know that there were a lot of people who didn't participate and quite a few people who were actively opposed to the demonstrations. And the demonstrators by eyeball seem to be mostly young people.
Yeah.
How widespread, and they were divided. The demonstrators themselves were divided. There were the 5 demands, but there were different forms of Hong Kong localism and so forth. And some people who wanted statehood for Hong Kong, and I think they were a minority, but there were a few such people. So what does the wider Hong Kong community really think? And are the demonstrations, are they going to continue to fight back, or will this crackdown really just put an end to this tradition of Hong Kong activism?
Okay, well, the last question is one, let's save that one for a moment. I think the youngsters that are protesting, to the extent that they advocate independence, probably have little support or self-determination. If it's perceived as code for independence, then that probably doesn't have wide support in Hong Kong. Not because people think it's a bad thing, it's just that they think it's not practical, it's not realizable. There's no way China's going to allow Hong Kong to separate itself from China. So they're not on board for that. And when it came to the violent behavior that some youngsters took up, throwing things and looked like the Hunger Games, rebellion, and even using language from the Hunger Games, which I mentioned in the book, some of this, I think the support for violence is relatively low. It's like 20%. Someone did opinion poll on it. 20% of the people think, well, violence is justified given the situation. This was opinion polls that were given in 2019 while these protests were going on. But when it comes to the overall demands of the protesters, I think the support is fairly wide. We saw this in that election that was held late in the year in 2019, where, as was always the case over these many years, in direct elections between pan-democratic camp and the pro-Beijing or pro-establishment camp, the pan-dems almost always get just short of 60% of the vote. So 60% of the people support them. And even after all these protests, Beijing, there was a kind of debate in Beijing whether to allow that district council election to go forward or not. And somehow Beijing came to the conclusion, vote, call it, and they use slogans, call for an end to violence and stuff. So while the protesters were using the district council elections as a referendum on their demands, Beijing was as well. It was saying that this is a referendum to stop violence. Don't vote for these guys. And to Beijing's shock and chagrin, the protest side won. The pan-dems took over 17 out of 18 district councils. And this is stunning in part because many people may not know that the pan-democratic camp virtually neglected the district councils over these many years. They're not wealthy enough, didn't have the resources, and district councilors have very little power. So very little investment was ever made in district councils. And pro-Beijing camp and the establishment camp combined would dominate the district councils, so that they were all expelled by this sudden initiative of turning it into a referendum. Shows you that there is pretty widespread support for the wider demands, the wider idea of maintaining the commitments in the basic law and so on. When you narrow it down to the more radical activities, then the support shrinks a lot. Nobody, even in the umbrella movement, I noticed, because I was there virtually every day as kind of an observer, someone who was commenting a lot on it, that while they occupied that street, as the time went on, many of those tents in the street were empty. So, and it was obstructing the public's access to the city. And so I think there was a bit of fatigue over that. So what goes on with these protests is a competition for the hearts and minds of Hong Kong people. And I think the calls for liberal values and democracy, freedoms, and human open society represent the dominant view in Hong Kong that the people have. But of course, such a view is always subject to limitations if the price extracted to achieve those goals becomes too high. And so that's what Beijing has been about, trying to ratchet up the cost of protesting. And now the risk of arrest and all these things that we talked about earlier are all there. Now, does that mean the protest movement now, because the cost is so high, I mean, they're arresting people right and left, and the pandemic means that they are not allowing these, they have to give a certificate of no objection to allow protests to go forward, which is basically like a permit. They're not giving this permission. And so the protests that occur now are unauthorized protests, and that's itself illegal. And then the risk of being pulled into more serious charges, because I didn't even go into the fact that national security law, the crimes involve mostly sentences from 3 years to life. It's not a misdemeanor being found guilty under the national security law. So that part of it, I talk about that in the book. I talk about the international response to this thing as well. But yeah, so will the protests keep going? I always like to think that Beijing should be happy when there's protests, because when Hong Kong people stop protesting, that's probably when they think it's futile. And that's when we're going to have an immigration problem.
Thanks. Now, here's a related question, I think, from Lucy. She says, is Hong Kong at risk of becoming the next Xinjiang or Tibet, a border region seen by the CCP as more uncontrollable and less loyal, and therefore requiring stricter, potentially very severe methods? So actually, let me pair that with a corresponding question. So some people say it's not going to be that bad. In fact, that's what Carrie, what's her name?
Carrie Lam.
Carrie Lam. I blocked on the name. You know, that's what she says. She says it's not going to be that bad, which I would interpret that, yeah, we're gonna hand out a certain number of heavy sentences, and then after that, everybody will shut up and things will return to normal. But then Lucy is saying, on the other hand, maybe instead things will get worse, and the Hong Kong people will not really back down. And you said they might emigrate, but somebody might say, no, there'll be continuing turmoil, or I don't know what, terrorism, or, because Lucy doesn't say in her question, but urban guerrilla warfare, something that will cause Beijing to feel that even the national security law framework that you described isn't enough, and they'll take even harsher measures. Now, of course, predicting the future, is fool's errand, but
Yeah,
how do you think maybe things are likely to evolve from here forward?
yeah. I'm kind of doubtful that people. I mean, right now it's kind of like a suicide mission to take to the streets and do some kind of protest that would draw attention to the issue you're trying to publicize. So it's a very perilous path to take. And so when there's immigration, I don't think that means the opposition is going to disappear. I think a lot of it will be transported overseas. And China has faced for years opposition from Tibetans in exile, from Uyghurs in exile. I think there's going to emerge a kind of opposition from Hong Kongers in exile. And I was interviewed recently in the Hong Kong Free Press, and that idea that Hong Kong, I expressed the concern that Hong Kong would not become just another Chinese city, that maybe the risk was greater that it would become a Tibet or Xinjiang, because my argument was that that risk is high because Hong Kong is a place where, at least till this day, there's significant opposition to the central government and its designs on the city, where I think with mainland cities, that kind of level of opposition doesn't exist. There's a few voices of protest, but not a substantial one in the way that Hong Kong is. So in many ways, Hong Kong is more analogous to Tibet, Xinjiang, in terms of how the local people relate to the central government as its policies are now carried out. I mean, that could change very much if the central government became more moderate and more receptive to the concerns of these populations. But that's not been the case. And so I think Hong Kong in some ways has that kind of risk. Now, Carrie Lam's thing, well, we'll just arrest a few. I kind of pointed out in my presentation that there's a lot of people that are affected by this law. It's not just a handful that they arrest. So you could imagine there's two kinds of arguments for moderating the effects of this law. One is that judges will attempt as best they can to interpret the articles of the law as consistent. I don't think they can overturn them as invalid, but try to interpret them in a way consistent with the ICCPR. And the other alternative that could see moderation, and the first alternative I should say would require courage in judges, because there's a lot of pressure on them not to do that. And they're condemned a lot by pro-Beijing elites and by Beijing officials and Beijing media when they dare to take a more rights conscious approach to some of these prosecutions. So that, I think, is not happening. And the other would be that somehow the national security law stops being enforced, that it's just hanging on the books like the sedition law before it and the emergency regulations ordinance. I just don't see that happening because they've set up such a bureaucracy. What do these people want to do if they're not enforcing it? They've got all these people in place to do that, to enforce it. So there's two courses of moderation seem to be blocked at the moment. So in that, I think when I talked to Hong Kongers, and I interviewed tons of them and looked at people on both sides, talked to both sides, I think there's a wide perception that the only way Beijing might be persuaded to not be so aggressive is through foreign pressure. So this is why the collusion provision is there, because Beijing doesn't want to experience that pressure. And at the same time, that's a signal that Beijing thinks that is the pressure that makes the price high for cracking down on Hong Kong. So, and at the same time, because the collusion provision's there, it would have to be Hong Kongers in exile who could promote and encourage foreign governments to do that, because the ones in Hong Kong would do so only at great risk themselves. So this is the dilemma faced by this protest movement. And I, like you say, it's a fool's errand. I really can't guess what direction it's going to go, but I'm not convinced that it's going to keep growing and get into a kind of insurgency. I'm doubtful, but I have no, so was it the ball that you have? I have nothing to tell me the answer to that.
Great. Okay, here's a question from Tung Biao. How did the CCP influence or control the Hong Kong police and judges? Will Hong Kong's judicial independence be fundamentally destroyed soon? So the Hong Kong police were thought to be a highly professional police force with very good civic relations. And now I think, as you pointed out in your remarks, that it turns out they're appear to be very strongly in support of the pro-Beijing establishment. I mean, it looks like they're not simply obeying legitimate orders, but that the police in general truly are against the pro-democracy faction. How did that happen? There's a great book by Christine Lowe about I forget the title, and maybe you remember the title.
I don't remember the title, no.
But about sort of the CCP presence in Hong Kong over the years. There has always been a presence, but I don't think we knew, and it may not be the case, that the CCP had achieved a lot of influence over the police force over the years. So Tung Biao's question is, how did the CCP gain this influence over the police? And then with respect to the judges, the setup now under the national security law, you described it very, very well, that if a judge wants to, let's say, interpret the national security law in a way is consistent with the ICCPR, that judge will simply be replaced from hearing national security law cases. Although one thing that I do wonder about is whether there are procedures that Hong Kong judges will follow, the presumption of innocence and the full hearing of evidence and so on and so forth, that would offer some protection. You mentioned that there are prosecutions ongoing for many, many years. That's a good thing, because in the mainland, once you get into court, you're finished in a day. But so Tung Biao's question is, will Hong Kong's judicial independence be destroyed? Will the judges all just yield, or will they still try to, be independent judges?
Yeah, and the police, the control over the police, I struggle with it. There's things going on here that kind of make me think a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I imagine there's some esprit de corps that the police simply want to be, when they're in 2019 faced with these protests and they're told to go out and do it, they're like good soldiers, they're going to go do their job. And then when the process of doing it, they've had some training from them, some of them even on the mainland were trained in national security kind of terrorism, I guess, fighting terrorism kinds of tactics. And so some of that just turns like a good soldier to do the bidding of people in charge. But then I also see, why would they designate only a special unit of the police to do this work? Makes me think, well, maybe they know more than we do, that some of the police have been, complaining about having to be in such a hostile relationship with their own people and their own society. So we just don't know why this so well respected. As I report in the book, there was something like 78% support in society for the Hong Kong police before Carrie Lam took office. And then it went down to 73% opposition to the police. So the popularity went really south very fast. And in many ways, many people believe that the protest was especially driven by these police tactics, that watching this in the news every day, that police shoving people down, staircases and all kinds of things, the problems in Yuen with violence and thugs and all of this, that the public became outraged against the police. But then when the police find themselves in this corner, maybe they do become more and more loyal to their side. They feel that they're being unjustly judged by the society. And so maybe that will encourage more of their more aggressive view of it all. So that's sort of how I view the co-optation issue of the police. The courts, yes, the answer, as Tong Biao correctly raises this question, is the courts are very much under pressure. As I pointed out, even selecting this list of judges already says something. But if you look at all the statements that have come out of officials and then some of these elite pro-Beijing Hong Kongers like Tony Kwok and others that even Glenville Cross, the British guy who's always writing in the China Daily, these people are putting a lot of pressure on the judges, and they're asking for various kinds of strategies to bring the judges under control. So you get the sense that the pro-Beijing camp and Beijing itself view the courts as the biggest obstacle to what they want to achieve. And that these judges will dismiss most of these cases that are brought against protesters who are just rounded up like cattle on the street because there's just no case to make against them. And the judges will enforce the procedural protections that you drew our attention to in how these matters are tried. Now, I interviewed Philip Dykes, who's the chairman of the bar in Hong Kong, and he was very much concerned that all of this is just going to overload the court. So there's some discussion of his comments in the book. And I interviewed a lot of lawyers, and their feeling was that the magistrates they used to be very sensitive, as common law judges are prone to be, to public order cases and free speech rights and everything. But there was some sense that was less. There was also, I report in the book from these interviews how the police were hiding defendants from their lawyers, and they had to do all kinds of tactics. So that's all in chapter 6 of the book, that based on those interviews there. And so all of this, I think, speaks very loudly that the rule of law institutions in Hong Kong, the bar, the law society, the courts, the Justice Department of Justice, all of it, I think, is under pressure from this thing. That's why I don't really accept the view that it just has a narrow application. I hope it does. I hope that one of those choices I mentioned of getting this not to be as bad as it seems happen, but I'm not optimistic because it seems like the fingers of this national security law are really putting pressure on it. And nothing can speak that more loudly than the provisions regarding the list of judges and dismissal from the list. Yeah.
Thanks. I think we have two more, maybe time for two more questions with quick answers. I want to acknowledge that CY Mock asked a question too, but we already answered it because it had been asked by somebody else. That question was whether the Hong Kong people in general or the younger generation support the independence of Hong Kong. You answered that. Here's a question from somebody. Please speak to the economic impacts of the protests, both within Hong Kong and the Beijing proper. And I would add or expand that to say the foreign financial institutions located there, how do you think they're going to react? And then the last question, I'll just put these together, you can answer them both, is again from Lucy. Will the Chinese government's refusal to let people emigrate to the UK instead of just letting the protesters leave? So I believe that the Chinese, maybe you can explain what the Chinese government's position is on these special passports that Britain wants to give, because that's kind of confusing what they can do about it. And anyway, her question there, the Chinese government refusal to let people emigrate to the UK instead of letting them leave, will that increase the chances of a more extreme response? So if they keep people who want to emigrate are not allowed to emigrate, would that make those people do something dangerous. And then she asks, and this is a good question for us to close with, what is the CCP endgame?
Oh, yeah.
So there's kind of three questions. One is economic impact in Hong Kong and Beijing. Then this question of emigration to the UK, and then the question of CCP endgame.
Okay, let's
You
see.
have like 3 minutes to answer them.
Yeah, I got three. I just look at my clock here. Yeah, well, the immigration question to the UK is being hinged, as it were, by the UK on the BNO passports, British National Overseas Passports that they had issued Hong Kongers, from the handover forward. If the Hong Kong person was born before July 1st, 1997, then they'd be eligible to get that. I think the British, in passing the new regulations on this, understood that, and I don't know, I'm guessing, I'm not absolutely certain, but I think you got the BNO passport I don't know if you had to go to the immigration office or not, but for some reason the British seem to think that if you don't require the person to actually get the BNO passport, that they could just apply directly to Britain to go to have this access to Britain, even without a BNO in hand. Maybe because that would take away China's ability to stop people from doing it. So under that logic, then you could just get this permission from Britain to go to Britain, and you could travel there even on a Hong Kong document, not a BNO, and then be allowed to stay in Britain. So unless China is prepared to hold Hong Kong people, to jail them, in effect, to hold them in Hong Kong by force and close down the freedom of travel that Hong Kong people enjoy, it's hard to know how China is going to stop people from taking up the British offer. I just don't think they can. On the level playing field, I think that's a big problem. I think we know the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank is under pressure, both from the United States, because it's now issued regulations that it can sanction companies' business in America if they do things harmful to Hong Kong people in terms of the protections they have in Hong Kong, and supporting the national security law might be such harm. And yet at the same time, Beijing is pressing all these companies to indicate their support for the national security law. They did that with Cathay, HSBC, and so on. And it seems that the US law would give the company an excuse to say, we're not going to say anything about this. We're not going to support that. But however you view it, I think what's emerged in Hong Kong is a very unlevel playing field. People who are loyal to Beijing or mainland companies, which have a huge presence in Hong Kong, are going to be treated more favorably than outsiders by whatever financial calculus goes on in Hong Kong, because companies are going to want to be seen, who do business in China especially, want to be seen not to be hostile to Beijing, not to be part of some Western conspiracy. So I think the economics of that is that the laissez-faire kind of economics of China is not that laissez-faire. It's kind of treats Beijing's friends better than its enemies. And I think people doing business in Hong Kong are going to face this. And so they're going to either have to decide if they want to stay there and do that, or go somewhere else with their business, so they're not subject to pressure from Beijing. So that's a big challenge to the business community. And the third question was, I forget.
What is the CCP's end game?
Oh, the end game. Oh God, it's really a hard one. I think I felt like they're badly advised in Hong Kong because they make most of their own troubles. And this is why you've heard me say already in this discussion that I think the people who have most done the damage in Hong Kong are the pro-Beijing camp, in not assisting Beijing and Hong Kong people, sort of mediating the differences between them and being able to convey the Hong Kong concerns in effective ways to Beijing, so that we don't keep ratcheting up this pressure on the society, which gets ratcheted up response, either through more protest or immigration if it becomes dire. So Beijing's endgame, I mean, 2/3 of the companies listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange are in some ways connected with China. So it has huge investments. We're basically talking about the New York of East Asia. It's this major financial center, and it seems to me they're shooting themselves in the foot if they just keep doing these things. You wrote an article, Andy, I know, in Foreign Affairs, interviewed some mainland scholar who thought that, well, Beijing thought it could win that. That it can do what it wants to do, and it's not going to have to pay a big price for it. It's confident that it has enough cards to play to keep the economic support it needs, and so on, so that its confidence means it can go ahead. As I understood the argument, you may have some more comment on that. But yeah, that's kind of how I viewed it, and I cited you in there for that.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. It's such a fascinating topic, and you've given us real close insight into how it's going to work, and sort of pessimistic picture overall. But we got to recognize the truth as it is. So thank you. And thanks to those who were listening and who sent very good questions. We appreciate that. So with this, we will close the meeting and hope to hear from you again in the future.
Very good. And thank all the participants as well. And thank you, Andy, for hosting this and organizing it. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye-bye.